Sir, we are live. You can start in 3, 2, 1.
All right. Hey, welcome everybody. I'm like crazy excited about tonight. All of you who've been like kind of walking with us in this season, you know, we have been deeply engaged in this conversation about racism as relates to the family. We've been dealing in some intentional ways about just a number of things as it relates to the family. So now we want to just kind of take a turn, because truthfully, the way our families, our communities are going to come out of this, the only way I believe we're going to be whole is going to be through our churches. We've already seen the systems of government and what their agendas are. They are committed to opening regardless of the challenges that we as people of color may be having. And so we have to prepare ourselves to continue life beyond this. And so the pulpit's going to be phenomenally important. So I'm going to ask everyone if you will share it now and invite others to come on. We have 3 amazing people, 3 incredible thinkers, each of them unique and diverse in their own way, but they bring so much to this moment. And I'm going to have them introduce themselves as they share their thoughts with us. And so we will start with this amazing woman. And so, ma'am, who are you?
I'm Cynthia Hale, the senior pastor of the Ray of Hope Christian Church in Decatur, Georgia.
All right. And then there are, I was gonna say the 2 bald-headed, the bald-headed guy, but both of them are. And so we'll go with the older bald-headed guy.
Yeah.
Then we'll go with the younger guy. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You are
Jerry Carter, pastor of Calvary Baptist Church in Morristown, New Jersey. Thank you, Bishop.
All right. And my frat brother. Yes, sir.
Willie Francois, pastor of Mount Zion Baptist Church, Pleasantville, New Jersey.
New Jersey.
Right. Fantastic. I know you.
New Jersey's in the house.
Yeah,
in the house tonight.
Yes.
So the 3 of you are significant preaching voices in this country. Let me start with Cynthia. Cynthia, kind of give us your idea or a synopsis of your philosophy as it relates to preaching and addressing the issues of race in this country.
Well, thank you so much, Bishop, for this opportunity. And I am delighted to be on with my other amazing colleagues, Jerry Carter and Willie Francois. I tell you, my philosophy is to hit the issue of racism and most things that I talk about head on. I don't play games. It is what it is, and people know about it. And so I believe that from the pulpit, we need to open up the dialogue and have real talk. As a matter of fact, on Sunday, I'm going to be talking about the Ahmaud Arbery case, and I wrote about it on Facebook, and so I'm going to address it head on, because this is the conversation that people are having in the beauty parlors now that it's open, the barbershops, book clubs, everywhere. And the church doesn't need to be the last place that people hear about it or have the dialogue. And so my philosophy is to hit it head on and to call it what it is, and not to skirt around or skate around the issues. Also, it's important, I think, because people, and we'll talk more about this, I'm sure, but all of this has such an impact, this pandemic that we're going through, the disproportionate numbers, this is systemic. Even though the Surgeon General, a Black man, tried to put the weight on us, the reality is we are not to blame for our own deaths, sicknesses, and the deaths that result from it. And so we have to address that so that people aren't feeling burdened by the foolishness that they hear coming from the White House and other places.
Got it. Jerry.
Yeah. Racism is, well, a call of the preacher, a call of the prophet. And we see it in the major prophets, minor prophets, classical prophets in the Old Testament. The role of the prophet is to call out sin and to accentuate and shine a light on what we call sin. And I want to categorize racism as sin.
Right.
And if the preacher's role is to call out sin, then a manifestation of sin is racism. And so I think we have gone through here in America the privatization of sin, where sins are just seen as though there's individual. You know, we got our top 4 or 5 sins, and sin is rarely seen as being corporate and being national. And so the reason I call racism a sin is because to be racist is to dehumanize.
Right.
And when you dehumanize anybody, or when one group dehumanizes another group, then you are participating in what the Bible will call sin, because sin is to dehumanize people. As a matter of fact, the only way you can be racist is when you begin to define people out of the human family. And when you define people out of the human family, then it becomes sin. So my philosophy between the relationship between preaching and race and the gospel and race is that as preacher prophets, we have to call out this thing called sin, and racism is sin.
Okay, Willie?
Yeah, man. I mean, it's hard going behind these 2 brilliant people I look up to. One of the things that I think is important is finding a homiletical tradition, or fine-tuning a homiletical tradition that one lives in. And I try to live in what I consider an abolitionist homiletic tradition. And that is to make the distinction between the various types of Christianities that exist in America. I wish there was only one Christianity that followed the real Jesus, but the reality is that Christianity continues to be co-opted, it continues to be thwarted in ways that we have to make clear that there is no single Christianity in this country, but we live in a country of Christianities. And I say that to say that there's a difference between plantation religion and Brush Harbor spirituality. And I want to live in the tradition of Brush Harbor spirituality that is abolitionist, anti-racist in nature, and does not perpetuate white evangelicalism as a political identity in Black faiths. So as one who wants to live in a abolitionist tradition of homiletics, that I think it's necessary, it's necessary to reclaim the tradition of the Brush Harbor, and reclaiming the tradition of the Brush Harbor, those slaves who moved beyond the gaze of the master, of the planter class, and practice a liberative form of connection to God and Jesus, is that there has to be that is a reclamation of the Hebrew prophetic tradition, a tradition that Jesus modeled in the best way. And that tradition, to me, does what Dr. Carter says, that it does not just focus on individual sins, but it talks about institutional sins, not just sins of self, but sins of systems. And white supremacy, racism, is America's founding sin. It is America's, as we often say, it is America's original sin. It's the original sin of the West. And I think that there has to be a way that we name white supremacy as sin, and realizing that when we talk about white supremacy, we're not talking about individual acts of discrimination, but we're talking about a system, a logic, a form of thinking that is at work beneath the conscience, that in many ways does not just impact white people, but it also lives in non-white people, right? And so when we preach about the sin of white supremacy, we're not talking about white skin, and we're not simply talking about what white people do, but we're talking about a particular logic that negates Black Black freedom, negates Black power, negates Black beauty, negates Black creativity. And if we take seriously the Imago Dei, that all people have been created in the image of God, then we have to be clear that when we talk about whiteness or white supremacy, when I'm talking about whiteness, I'm not talking about skin color. I'm talking about a particular logic. I'm talking about a particular structural way of being in the world. We're talking about evil in at least three metaphors for me. That whiteness is sin because it separates. That's what Paul tells us about sin as separation. Whiteness is demonic because it diminishes human capacity and human life, but it also makes whiteness an idol. It allows it to ascend to a height of ultimate truth in ways that need to be called out.
Okay, wow. So Cynthia, build on this idea of this system that we are called, because it's interesting. I think a lot of times, like what happened to the young man in Brunswick, right? And we look at the individual, act of senseless murder. We look at this individual and we look at these quote unquote singular acts of behavior. But as a preacher of color, as an African-American preacher, how should we, and I'll start with Cynthia, and all you can just kind of start just flowing. How should we address these systems that, as Willie stated, perpetuates a consciousness? How should we from the pulpit address these systems? How do we do that?
I think you have to start with a theology of who we are as people. And Willie said, the Imago Dei, that's where I start, that we were all created in the image and likeness of God. That's the foundation. And helping people to understand that doesn't have anything to do with race, class, color, ethnicity. All people are created in the image and likeness of God. So we began there. And anything or any one community, system, organization, whatever, that does not recognize that and begins to dehumanize people, as Jerry said, that again is sin. And so we have to address that, helping people to understand who they are, in who they were made to be in the image of God. And so whatever system begins to chip away at that is sin. See, I think people need to be able to recognize, as they did, when my governor decided he was opening up certain shops that primarily catered to African Americans, or the ones that we would, and also in some instances where they work. I want them to be able to see, we want our people to be able to see, this is not individual, this is a system at work to destroy us or to set us up. And how we avoid that is seeing ourselves differently from the way they want to see. Two men, whoever, the guy who pulled the trigger, Travis, and his father, they didn't kill Ahmaud. They were just the pawns in the hands of a racist system. And we have to be able to see that, to recognize that immediately. And now the cover-up is sinister because they are playing these games. These district attorneys are playing these games about, I recused myself and I turned it over to somebody else. No, they just did what they always do. They just covered it up. They tried to until that video surfaced. So I think it's key that our people recognize that immediately and not be afraid to name that, which means, of course, that we have to name it for them. We have to often give people the language and the theology to talk about it.
Yeah. I think that naming it, Cynthia, I mean, I'll just tag along with that. Naming it is so critical because sometimes, you know, the job of the preacher is just to raise a consciousness.
Right.
Even if you don't always have answers and solutions, you got to raise a consciousness when it comes to racism, because when it comes to African Americans, sometimes we get fooled into thinking that we live in a post-racial society, especially, you know, after the couple presidential terms, President Obama. We begin to get tricked and fooled until we are reminded, from like in Brunswick, Georgia, that we don't live in a post-racial society. So I think that a part of the job of the preacher, and we can't leave this to the media or to the politician, but a part of the job of the preacher is to raise a consciousness on the part of African Americans that this thing, that race is still an issue here. It's at the heart of America. And the opposite, on the opposite side, when it comes to those in dominant culture, white folks, that our job is not necessarily to raise a consciousness because they think we live in a post-racial society, but because racism is so woven into the fabric of America, and it's so much a part of the air that you don't even know that you are a part sometimes of a racist system. I mean, this country was founded in a context of racism, whether it's the enslavement of African Americans, the genocide of the indigenous people here, the annexation of Mexican lands and all that was a part of the founding of this nation. And so if that's a part of the founding, it's so much a part of it that you may not even recognize that you're inhaling that kind of air. And so I think, go ahead, Sam.
Go ahead. I just want to interject this. You
She
know what
got
I
it.
thought about?
Whatever you just said.
Yeah, we're just rolling.
You know what I thought about? Racism. COVID-19 is like racism. People are asymptomatic. They racist and they don't even know it. I am on a lot of boards, okay, with white people. Some of my best friends. That's what they would say about me.
Right.
But sit there long enough and they will say something.
Yeah.
And it catches them off guard because where did that come from? I said, your heart. You're a part of the system. You didn't even know it was there. That's what we're dealing with. I used to live in Brunswick. I was with the federal prison system. And they sent me there to start the staff training academy. And can I tell you that the Black people there used to walk around and they didn't even look you in the eye. They couldn't look folks in the eye. There was still that slave mentality. And I asked folks, I said, why? Look me in my face. I'm Black like you. They weren't used to it. They said, okay. They could not look white people in their eye because they had been trained, socialized.
Let me, so, you know, because it's interesting where this is going. And I'm looking at the comments on Facebook. It's like, it's crazy. It's you all have opened up some incredible stuff. To Jerry and Willie, let me, this idea of racism or this system, or how do we, as the Black preacher, how do we manage it ourselves so that we don't become bitter because of it and it affects our preaching? How do we, and maybe that's an unfair question, and maybe, or maybe it's not even a question to be asked. You know, we go back to the gospel of Jesus Christ, mercy, compassion, love, all of that we preach. How do we, as the Black preacher, the informed Black preacher, not just the Black preacher who's looking for a revival, but you three, how does an informed, engaged voice like like you three, manage it from a personal level so it doesn't negatively affect what is your prophetic assignment, not just to your community, but to the world? Or is that a fair question?
I think it's a
Fair question.
because I think it's a fair question, because what we know is that hatred destroys the host, right? And if we allow the cancer of hatred to eat away at our organs of creativity and spiritual depth, then we actually find ourselves unfit to do the work in some way. So it is a fair question to think about, how do we filter our own relationship to white supremacy and the history and those histories of white supremacy, without allowing it to create something in us that we cease to be as fully human, as abundantly human as we can be. So I think it is an important question for the ways that we allow hatred to eat away at our humanity, which is easy to do, because Baldwin says to be a Black person in America and to be semi-conscious is to constantly be enraged, right?
Right.
It's a matter of can you channel that rage in constructive ways, I think is important. Because I mean, even Luther talks about there should be some anger, some rage in some of this without allowing it to become hatred. One of the things that I think is important, just for me, as I think about the intersectionality of identity, right, is that yes, I'm a Black man, and I do know that there are social deficits connected to being Black in an anti-Black nation. But I also know that I benefit from male privilege, right? I benefit from patriarchy and from sexism in ways that I'm often unaware of. And so one of the ways that I think about ways that I guard against becoming bitter is reminding myself that I am still on a growth continuum as it relates to oppression. And there are ways that I perpetuate and am complicit with forms of oppression that I need to be attentive to. And so I approach prophetic preaching and I approach anti-racist preaching with a kind of gratitude, understanding that I too, the same way the white supremacists and the white supremacist nation, is all at some moment, at some point in this ongoing, evolving work of God's redemption and God's liberation. And so I guard against being bitter, because I do know that there's the demon of male privilege and male supremacy that also lives in me, that I'm constantly trying to exercise.
Jerry, jump in.
I think one of the ways that as the preacher has to, when it comes to the congregation, when it comes to issues, you have to have a healing closeness and a healthy distance at the same time. A healing closeness and a healthy distance, so that you can sit back and watch what's happening and actually bring the word of God to bear upon what's happening. Now, one of the only ways that you can do that, again, is if you have some distance from it, and that's in the meditation time, that's in the prayer time, on and on and on. I think that one of the ways that I try to guard against that bitterness and that bitter core is being able to distinguish between prophetic preaching and just ecclesiastical venting. Those two are different. The prophetic preaching is to declare, yes, what thus saith the Lord, based on the word of God. And sometimes ecclesiastical venting, which we all do sometimes, is kind of just spilling out my guts before the people. And, as natural as that is, and sometimes that even that can be redemptive, but I have to just be careful with that and learn to distinguish between what is prophetic preaching and what is just venting, and make sure that I'm not just going out to the people and just venting my frustrations. The frustrations ought to be woven into the proclamation of the word, but my frustrations cannot be at the center of what I'm preaching. It has to be what thus saith the Lord. And when I preach what thus saith the Lord, even my frustrations come up under his lordship.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Let me ask this question, because I'm jotting down questions that are coming through our Facebook live, but I want to throw this out to any of you. Any of you can jump in. I'd love to hear this question answered by all of you. What are some of the themes that must be preached when you address the issue of race in America? What are some of the themes that you feel are necessary, Willie and Cynthia and Jerry, to be preached when you address this issue of racism? What are some of the themes? Because right now I see a lot of preachers on, and so a lot of them are chiming in. But I think one of the most important things is that we need to be targeted in our preaching. I think I've seen that in all three of you, even in your thought pattern. What are some of the things that you think are necessary to be preached and communicated when you deal with the issue of race from the pulpit?
Self-esteem is one of them.
Sure.
What does that look like, Cynthia, to you? Because that's one of your unique gifts, is preaching and teaching and equipping people of color, equipping us in that way. What does that look like for you?
It begins with Psalm 139. I think you probably know that. Oh Lord, you have searched me and you know me.
Sure.
And I will praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knows right well. So it's giving people a sense of worth and dignity, helping them to understand how valuable they are to God and then to others, helping them to understand that God created them with purpose and destiny, all of us, and that I love that verse that says in 16, all the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. And that whole sense of, you mean before I was even born, before you even thought about, you know? So you have worth, you have dignity, your life matters. And I think when you lay that as a foundation and help people to understand that, that certainly helps. I went to white schools from the time I was in the second, third grade. And I struggled with self-esteem. And it was when I heard that scripture and began to unpack it and have it unpacked for me that I understood what these folks are saying and thinking about me is not the real story. That I have to get clear about that. And that I am gifted. I'm beautiful. I'm brilliant. I can do anything. I can be anything. I mean, having that sense, that's what makes you look folks in the eye. I've never had a problem looking folks in the eye. Because I want to share something else with you. I had a 6 foot tall, gorgeous daddy. My daddy and I would go out together, walk, talk. He infused me with worth and value, told me I could be anything. Looked me in the eye and said, you look me in the eye. And he said, and when you start working in corporate America, I want you to look those white men in the eye. So when I worked for the Bureau of Prisons as the first female chaplain in an all-male federal prison, I could look folks in the eye, my warden, the associate warden, and talk straight to them. I was not intimidated because I know who I am. If we can help people to know who they are. And they were racist in that They were racist in that prison. But my granddaddies called me one day. My dad had already told me, my granddaddy said, "Now, if you have any problems at all, Mr. Hale and Mr. Hilton said, we'll get in the car and come down there." I said, "I can handle it, Granddaddy, because y'all taught me how. I got it." So when there is, we need strong men, strong Black men, not just in the pulpit. We need them in the family. We need strong Black women to infuse their children. I didn't get all this from the pulpit. I got it at home first.
That's amazing. That's
I-
amazing. What are some of those things? That's an amazing statement that you just made. That's an amazing statement. What are some of the things, Willie, Jerry? What are they?
Yeah, I think the starting point is what Cynthia said, and that is one theme is just reaffirming our humanity and our Christian identity, because particularly so many of our young people, a lot of them go to white schools, they live in white neighborhoods, and so they're always made to fit in and to feel like something's wrong with them because other people set the standard. So they will believe that their nose is broad, their hair is kinky, their skin is too dark, or whatever, on and on and on. And even if we never admit that, sometimes Black folks internalize the assessment of the oppressor.
That's right.
We actually internalize it, and whether we're conscious of it or not. And so once again, the whole theme of identity and worth is critical. But I think a second theme is preaching the theme of empowerment, because Black folks week after week have to fight and battle racism. And so a part of our preaching has to mobilize them and strengthen them for some of the individual fights that they run into in battles, and then some of the community battles, some local battles. I don't care if it's the YMCA, on and on and on. People have to be empowered and equipped. So as we raise esteem, we also need to help to infuse power. So when they leave the sanctuary, they are wrestling against principalities and powers, and so that's a second theme, is empowerment. And for me, a third theme is to preach what Cornel West called a revolutionary patience. A revolutionary patience, so that anger doesn't get the best of African Americans, because it's real easy to just go out to the streets and just get angry. But Cornel West talks about being patient in a revolutionary way. And revolutionary patience does not mean passivity, but it does mean participation with a sense of anticipation that God's going to get involved. And so those are a couple themes that I would add to the theme of self-worth.
That's good.
Yeah, I love this because one of the things that I think is important and has been named, but I borrowed the phraseology from Dr. King, who studied as a personalist and understood the dignity and the centrality of the person, and so that is preaching somebodyness, right? Reminding people that they are somebody. And part of that somebodyness, I think, is necessary to talk about what Howard Thurman calls that spark of divinity, right? That within humanity, that humanity is human because of the divinity that lives within the human frame, within the nature of humanity that we find from those early Genesis creation stories. So this idea of somebodyness. I also think it's important to talk about freedom. To be able to freedom has to be a theme in preaching that engages racism and speaks to people who have power that is latent and dormant and haven't figured out how to arouse and awaken that power. Another theme I think is important is the pre-American legacy, that the story of our story does not begin
Right,
at
right,
19, right? Our story, we live in a nation that's built on stolen land and stolen people, but our story predates American kleptocracy. Our story starts, and when I talk about pre-American legacy, I'm talking about the people who are depicted in the book that we preach from are our people.
Sir. Yes, sir.
These are Afro-Asiatic people that we are descendants from in some way. And then I think that because Dr. Martha Simmons, your friend, is one of my mentors, and preaching has to have a behavioral ethic, as she often says. And I often think about that as a pneumatic politics, right? That our politics in the world, our action in the world, has to be fueled by and rooted in the Holy Ghost, right? That the Holy Ghost has to be more than a being that makes us shout, that being that makes us run around, but the Holy Ghost has to also fuel our political engagement and our public advocacy.
That's right.
So, okay. So, first of all, you all are making me look really smart, and I appreciate the three of you.
You are smart.
I am now officially considered to be an intellectual. Thank you so much, because everything they're saying, I wrote down and gave it to them for notes. So I want y'all to know that. Yes. It's interesting. One day I was looking at my congregation, I was preaching, and I saw sadness on their faces. And of course, my initial response was to take it personal. And then I literally felt the Spirit of the Lord arrest me and say, there are Black people in America dealing with a lot. What is it? What is the challenge? Okay, Willie, I'll start with you on this one. What is the challenge of preaching to people who are dealing with this kind of pathology, this kind of victimized mentality? What is the challenge to preaching to people who maybe in corporate America, but they've been dealing with the subtleties of racism? Getting in the elevator and Cynthia, two people move over, and you have to pretend like you didn't see them. We've been dealing with, I don't call it social distancing because I think there's a whole history beside, with social distancing. But we've been dealing with physical distancing a long time.
Sure.
we know what it feels like to walk down the hall and people slide over. Willie, what because Willie, you're what? 30 what?
33.
Jesus. Jerry, that day
30.
we
That's crazy.
can't stand you. We forgive you.
That was hard to come out of my mouth. I'm like, 33, Jesus, where'd the time?
We forgive you.
Okay.
We forgive you. But okay, 33, I hate this word, but I'll use it. A 33-year-old millennial preacher who has bought in, who reads and writes and struggles with, has embraced this fight. But how does it feel to preach to people that you may see as engaging in this internalizing of oppression, in this struggle? What are some of the challenges to preaching in that context? Or are there any challenges to preaching? And then I'd like for all of you to jump in on that.
I mean, there's serious challenges to preaching, particularly to preaching anti-racist messages, and the fundamental part is I think there is this internalized oppression that not only do we internalize and start to see ourselves through the lenses of dominant communities. We don't just see people move away from us and clench their purses when we walk into an elevator, but we also do that. And so this internalized oppression has created a form of anti-Black sentiment that lives inside of us. One of the greatest hurdles I run into is that
go back and say that again, because I think that's a huge point. What you just said, say that again.
Yeah, so it's I mean, this it's internalized oppression. It causes us to see ourselves through the lens of the oppressor, that we have bought into this anti-Black sentiment in some way, that has convinced us that we have become subconsciously convinced that there is something pathological around Blackness. And
Stop right there.
and
Stop
we
right
don't.
there. I'm jumping in. Here's why I'm jumping in. There is a movement in our churches away from what we have always considered to be our tradition to a system or an optic of worship that says in order to be attractive to certain people, you have to dress a certain way, have a certain worship sound, your sanctuary has to look a certain way, because that is what sells, that is what attracts, and that's what wins crowds. I'm sorry I had to jump in, but I think you tapped into something. As a preacher, then, how do you help us wrestle with that? Because that's a huge statement.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a huge statement, and it sort of, it produces a type of powerlessness that is psychologically entrenched, but it shows up in our bodies in particular ways. And I think the greatest hazard that this creates is that some of this internalized oppression is actually pragmatism. It's a way of surviving, that we've accepted a level of inferiority because that's actually how you survive in this. As I was listening to Dr. Hale talk about not looking in the eyes of white men or white people, that was a survival mechanism that has been passed on as a heritage. And so those are at least some of the hurdles to preaching these types of messages. And one of the things that I come across is that preaching pro-Black messages or anti-racist messages always become identified as anti-white messages, which they are not, or anti-white people messages, which they are not, or anti-American messages, which they are not, or they become, oh, why is he always so political? Right? And so I think that what has to happen is there has to be a consistent diet of this somebodyness and this freedom that Dr. Hale demonstrated for us, even here on the screen, that there has to be this raising of one's sense of self and sense of worth that predates the idea that has to precede the idea that one has the power to actually change a system or change the world. There has to be this investment of this endowment of one's humanity that comes through the preaching moment. And I say this and I quit, because what's so hard about preaching the positiveness of humanity is because for generations we were told we weren't human. Right. And then once we accepted that we were human, we were brought into a version of Christianity that told us that being human ain't nothing, right? That to be human makes you sinful, to be human makes you depraved, to be human makes you distant from God. And so we fought hard to be human, and then the moment we recognized ourselves as human, then we found out that even being human has its own theological baggage, right? So there has to be in our theology something that celebrates the dignity and divinity of human being created in the image of God. There has to be this insistence on somebodyness as a precursor to mobilizing and moving people to Christian to Christian discipleship that combats structural racism.
And I think
I'm Cynthia. Yes, please.
We also have to teach. Just let me say this quickly: who we are as an African people.
Wow.
I mean, that is so important. And folks may struggle against that, but I still do. I don't care. I take us back. Yeah. To where we came from and to help us to understand. And I think whether it's a fashion statement, some people are getting it because hair is nappy for real today. Anybody's trying to have no perm. Straight hair is natural hair that's been pressed out, but like we used to do it. But I mean, I think folks are getting a sense of who they are, and we just have to stay with it. We can't, even when it's hard for them to digest. Willie is right. We have to constantly give them a diet of this freedom and power that Jerry talked about, and who worth and dignity. And so what if they call us political? We're trying to save lives, you understand? We're trying to save lives.
Let me ask you this question, and then we'll jump to Jerry. Cynthia, why is it important to do this? I mean, I think because I was actually on mute. I kept trying to jump in. And I discovered I was on mute. So you really answered the question. So sometimes you just need to shut up and let people finish their thoughts. How about that? Great lesson for the host. Thank you very much. In my mutedness,
Since you gave us our notes, we're helping you to understand some things too.
In my mutedness, I've been taught. Just be quiet. So, but why is this important? And then Jerry, you can chime in. Why is this important to do though? I mean, but I think you said it.
Why is what important to do? Why is what important to do?
Why is it important for us to celebrate the dignity of our I mean, why is it important to celebrate this stuff in our preaching about our humanity and all? Why is that important to do in preaching?
I think it's important because, again, it gives people a visual, understanding of who we are. And so, like when, for example, I did this whole series on who we are as Black people, going all the way back to Africa. This was before Roots even came out. That's where I started. And then I did this whole series on what it means to be free. How Black men are supposed to be free, and the struggle that Black men have to be free in America, and then Black women and young people. Because what I realized was that my church started out as a young adult church, and these were buppies back then, okay? And they thought they had it going on. And to a certain extent, we did, but we were still use the N-word, okay? And so it's important for them to see. And then I did this whole thing on Blacks in the Bible. Wow, that blew it out of the water. And I still make references constantly about who we are. And when I see a Black person in the Bible, I say, that person's Black, don't you? And I think it's important for people to constantly get a diet of that.
Sure.
And also to wear it. We have to wear it.
Jerry, as you spent these so many years preaching and going through this journey of preaching, what would you say to preachers today to help them navigate the culture that we presently exist in? And as a teacher of preachers, what advice would you give to preachers today to be able to navigate the culture of preaching today?
And particularly when it comes to preaching on issues of racism issue, I think the one thing that I would say to preachers and cautions about is, even with this preaching to elevate the dignity of Black folks and to raise our self-esteem, we need to do that without making Blackness an idol.
Very good.
Okay.
Because even our Blackness needs to be redeemed. No matter how much we celebrate it, and we need to celebrate it, because it's been squashed and we've been subjugated. So I understand the need to elevate it and talk about how great we are and all that, but we are also part of the company of sinners.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing I would say to preachers is balance it out, that whole dignity thing with also our sin issue, ourselves and our need for our redemption. The other thing I would say is that preaching from an Afrocentric perspective, I think is real healthy for us, because that's the perspective that we come from. But that Afrocentric perspective, that hermeneutical lens is something we need to be suspicious of so that we don't go at every biblical text from that angle, because Afrocentricity needs to be under Christocentricity. And so the Christocentric lens has to be the primary one that we look through. And if you look through that hermeneutical lens, you will automatically hit issues of race, because Christ is into wholeness and he's into lifting up people. So what I would say to preachers is all of us need to be suspicious of the hermeneutical lens that we bring to an interpretation of text, so that we don't impose on it our own biases, even if those biases have been baptized in Afrocentricity.
Okay, so Willie, you are 33. I'm gonna ride that for at least 30 seconds, right?
He jealous.
Because you have become, and I'm sure there are others out there, but you have become one of the faces and voices of this for your generation. First, the first question I would ask is, how did you get here? Second question I would ask, because it was interesting to hear Cynthia's story, and her story gives weightiness to her unique hermeneutic and homiletical approach, but her integrity in the pulpit in preaching and speaking to not only her congregation but to her community. How did you get here? And then secondly, what would you say to others of your age group to inspire them as preachers to at least commit to this to this assignment and to this passion to empower Black folks?
Yeah, man, thanks, man. Well, I mean, that
I like you.
That is, it's a question that takes me in a couple of directions. One of the ways I get to prophetic ministry was through Morehouse College and the Martin Luther King Jr. Chapel there, and really just buying into this Jesus that I read Howard Thurman write about. So it was really Jesus and the Disinherited that caused me to reimagine my entire understanding of Christian identity. That was the moment where I was able to see Jesus' humanity in ways that allowed me to affirm my own historical situatedness, to know that Jesus was of a second-class community. He was from a crucified class, right? He wasn't the only one crucified, but he was from a crucified class of people, a lynch class, as we can think about Jesus' time. And so putting Jesus in that context is and taking seriously that I'm a follower of a man who was born of a teenage mother, who was a infant refugee escaping the threats of a insecure politician, who was living on the underside of religious authority of sorts, who himself was a victim of his criminal justice system in the first century, the same way my people are victims of the criminal justice system in the 21st century. And so situating Jesus at Morehouse, like digging into this Black prophetic tradition through someone that we don't often think of as a Black prophet, like Howard Thurman, and how he talked about Jesus was one of those first entries for me. And I say that because I went to Morehouse as a Texas Baptist. Everything you can think about that identity, I embody. Although I didn't really believe this, I accepted that women should not preach because that's what my pastor told me. And I always had problems with it, but it wasn't until I walked into Sisters Chapel as a freshman at Morehouse College and I heard Bishop Bastow McKenzie preach that I realized I had to let go of that lie. And so that's why when I talk about racism, I can't talk about racism disconnected from the other types of forms of social control, like homophobia, like sexism, like classism, because all of those things are intertwined together. And when I started my journey of purging myself, self-emptying myself of toxic masculinity, that's what helped me to start moving toward this Christianity that is radical, revolutionary, and prophetic.
Yes, sir.
Man, okay, so
Next
If I
discussion
want-
has
and
to
if-
be on sexism. The next discussion has to be on sexism, okay?
okay, we'll do it next week. What you doing next week? What you doing next week? I mean, we're on the road. What you doing next week? So, and you're right, it does, because I think that there is a whole dynamic that goes with that we have to dig into. To any of you can answer this. We've got 5 minutes, and I don't think people would be happy with us if we end in the next 5 minutes. But I'm trying to stay true to an hour, because I would rather have people wanting more than people going, "Are y'all done?"
Right.
So right now the numbers are still increasing. So y'all are doing great work. It's been amazing. It's interesting, and I will say this. I will let you all redeem your time. It's interesting listening to the three of you. In today's preaching culture, we don't really talk like this anymore. This is kind of in isolated pockets, even in seminaries. This is kind of in isolated pockets. So it's refreshing to hear this conversation, because I think that there are a lot of people who have jumped on, who are being energized by what they're hearing. I mean, even as I listen to the three of you, it's making me think, how do I preach in this season? One, without the crowd and without all of the other stuff, and I'm being forced to be content, because charisma does you no good when the only person in the room is a camera person.
Right.
Yeah, you can't high five your neighbor unless they got multiple personalities. then you might want to leave the room.
Bishop, may I say something quickly?
Please.
Earlier when you asked the question, and I didn't respond because I was really enjoying what the brothers were saying, but you asked the question how not to be angry or bitter.
Yes.
It's conversations like this that keep me balanced. I mean, that cause me not to go off when I really want to. Because see, if I can talk it through, then I can think it through, but sometimes my thinking takes me to another level that I shouldn't be on to be healthy in the pulpit, as Jerry was talking about earlier. But it's conversations like this. I call this grown folk conversation.
Absolutely.
Just
Absolutely.
real conversations, which we need more of.
Sure. And I agree with you. So what is your takeaway from tonight? What is the one thing that you want the Black community to know as it relates to preaching and racism? What is your personal takeaway? But what is the one thing that you want to be able to say to us as it relates to preaching and racism?
The one thing I would say is that is very succinct, is that you can't preach the gospel without dealing with this issue, because at the heart of the gospel is making people whole.
That's huge. That's huge. Willie? Cynthia, go ahead.
I was just going to say that you can't preach it unless you are whole.
That's huge.
You have to be whole. You have to be able to admit your own complicity, in whatever way you're complicit in oppressing others. Any anger or bitterness that you might have, you have to address it. And I think that, Jerry talked earlier, I think it was Jerry, about patience, Cornel West. We also have to deal with forgiveness. If I hadn't forgiven some people, I really could not even talk to you tonight. I belong to a mainline Protestant white denomination. I've had to forgive some folk. Or I wouldn't be preaching today. I mean, really, there was a point at which I was so angry that I knew I couldn't continue until I forgave. So we have to talk about forgiveness. And I don't mean just, well, forgiveness is forgiveness.
Let me tell you what I just saw, Cynthia. Literally on the thread, people started saying "ouch" and "wow." You want to know what's and I'll say this and then Willie, you can share your comment. Just as a very transparent moment, one of the things that I've discovered is that a part of the genius of preaching is the transparency of the preacher to confront their own fears and failures while trying to walk people into a place of wholeness. And that ultimately, if we are not transformed beings, we will bring people into our brokenness and give them permission to be dysfunctional.
Right.
And so even as we struggle with our own Blackness, and I mean, because it's real easy to be angry today as a Black man and a Black woman in America. It's real easy when the president says, go ask somebody from China. Go ask China that question. And you know in your heart, he's saying to every person, all of y'all need to shut up and sit down. When they decide that it's time to attack Obama, and then when our president says something back and they tell him shut up.
That's when you want to go for it.
That's when you want to go. Oh, that's how we doing this today?
I live in Georgia. That's why Trump is still alive.
That's how you want to do this, Mitch?
Come on.
That's what you want to do?
Come on.
So I think you tapped into something incredibly powerful. Willie, you honestly, ever since you came to Florida for the intensive, you have inspired me in ways that you won't understand. You know, because I'm a Howard Thurman addict. Anyone knows me knows I'm a Howard Thurman addict. So yeah, I'm a Howard Thurman addict. So every time you mention his name, I get warm and fuzzy because that's my dude, right? So come on, talk to us. What is your takeaway from tonight, and what do you need us to hear in terms of closing statement?
Yeah, I think that just to overstate Dr. Hale's point is that, yeah, that there needs to be a conversation around preaching and sexism because one thing we do well is that the Black church has been the greatest weapon against white supremacy in this country, and we've also been one of the greatest perpetuators of Black women's subjugation in this country, and we have to atone for that history in some ways. So the first thing I want to say is that if the preacher is going to be whole, the preacher has to go through his own sort of kenosis. We have to empty ourselves as Jesus emptied himself of the privilege of that. We have to keep interrogating ourselves and continue to find a way to empty ourselves of the things that get in the way of us speaking truth to power because we're complicit with the power. Another thing we must do is we can't play, because of the existential threat on non-rich and non-white lives in this country, we can't play oppression Olympics either. Is that we have to preach about mass incarceration and mass deportation.
Yes, sir.
We have to be able to, we have to be multivocal when we talk about oppression and injustices in our country. And I fundamentally think that, and this is my bias, is that Black preaching is what has made America more of a democracy each and every year. And it's because of the power and the foolishness of Black preaching to believe that we can remake this nation in an image of the beloved community.
Okay, it's 9:04. I don't even know how to end this, because this has been phenomenal. The response has been amazing. We are going to put this on YouTube. I think it's going to be SPNBC, Jack's Space, and then Media. We need to watch this again and again and again and again and again and again and again. I think we need to do something again next week, or at least in the next 2 weeks. I don't think we're done with this. I think we have to deal with sexism in the pulpit. And I think that we have to have that conversation. So Cynthia, I'm gonna reach out to you when, in the next day or so when this is over. Every Sunday at 3:00, we're doing something called Seminary on Sunday. And I think it's interesting because this week, Dr. Gina Stewart is going to be leading it. It's on a Zoom platform. Anyone that wants to, it's working on preaching, because one of the things that's been exposed in this is preaching, good and bad.
Sure.
We've seen some pretty bad preaching on Facebook Live. Yeah. we see some people, and it don't matter what color, what race, what gender. There's been some people you've been like, Jesus. I'm sure you called
somebody listening to them though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So people are clamoring for this and craving for this. They want a part 2. I'll let you all know by tomorrow if we can get a part 2 out of this. I think we've tapped into some amazing things. The 3 of you are absolutely incredible, and thank you for doing this. Thank you for helping the body of Christ, because that's been kind of that's been my weight in this. It's been, how can I help the body of Christ? So thank you for doing that. Cynthia, why don't you tell us something about where you are in terms of social media, wherever you are, or if you want to do that at all. Jerry, is there anything you want to tell people, let people know, any books or anything? Same with you, Willie. Is there anything you want to let people know? They can follow you, they can purchase something, they can go to this. I don't care. Yeah, you guys have been amazing. At least give people a chance to know what you're doing. So anything, book, Cash App. In this culture, everybody got a Cash App. My grandson's 4 years old. He got a Cash App. Everybody got a Cash App.
I'm good.
Okay. All right. Anybody? Books? Anything you want to share?
I will say that in November, we're going forward with the How Should I Hear Preaching Conference.
Sure.
November, I think it's 12, 13, 14. I don't know. I think it's 12, 13, 14. The more information will be coming out within the next couple of weeks.
Absolutely. Willie? The latest movement that you're leading.
Oh,
I love it.
Trying to breathe, man. Trying to stay alive and not be blamed for my own murder, man. If I get
that's not funny, but that's the truth.
That is the truth.
Oh my
goodness.
God.
Oh my goodness. Wow. Well, you have forced the saints to start praying right now. There's a couple of mothers in Alabama going, in the name of Jesus, bless that young man, keep him, Jesus. So listen, y'all, thank y'all for tuning in. Please share this. This was incredible. I think we're on to something. And since most of us gonna be in the house till July or August, then we ain't got a whole lot to do. Because Jerry Carter and I have binge watched Netflix and Hulu. So
y'all need to come down here and run with me. Just come run a minute.
Well, your state is open.
All that Netflix will make you crazy. Y'all need to come up.
I ain't coming to Georgia to run. So
is my state.
That's the wrong
state's open too.
Look, I live in the country.
In New Jersey.
So, hey, listen, guys, thank y'all so much. Be blessed. You guys be blessed and be safe. And we will see you probably next week, because I think we got a lot more mileage in this. Be blessed, guys. Thank you, 3. You guys are amazing. Have a great night. All right.
Dr.